EU Army. First of all, the author, Mrs. von STORCH, for 4 minutes.
Ja, sehr geehrter Herr Kommissar.
Commissioner, there are even fewer people in the plenary today than there were on Tuesday when Mr. Juncker got upset. Now, I can understand that because the answers will be read out by the Commissioner who isn't responsible for this area of policy. The answers haven't been made available in advance because you said you're coming anyway. But if you're going to just read out pre-prepared statements, you might as well give it to us in advance, and then we can better discuss them. The Commission answers don't really say much, and they often avoid the crux of the matter. The Commission doesn't want to be subject to parliamentary scrutiny. However, I'm not giving up hope, and that's why I have questions for you. The Commission is proposing setting up an intervention army which would be able to carry out combat missions in neighbouring countries. I wonder why Europe hasn't learned anything from the interventions made by the US. Juncker is talking about defending the values of the EU with an EU army. That means that, like the US, we would be defending democracy with an army. Would we be defending gender mainstreaming in Liberia with an army? It's also been said that an EU army might be deployed in an EU member state. Against who? Against a government of Poland or a government of Hungary? Would Austrian units be shooting at insurgents in Slovenia? I'm really lost for words. Perhaps you could give us some more information about that. The EU army is really the last thing that we actually need, and there's simply no need to duplicate what NATO already does. The NATO must remain a defence alliance, but it's a myth to suggest that the EU has guaranteed peace. It's NATO that's been doing that, and NATO should remain playing that role. An EU army would threaten peace in Europe. You'd like to play strong man in the face of Russia, but we don't need to because we've got NATO. We don't need to duplicate structures like this. The EU army also undermines, or could undermine, the neutrality of Ireland, Malta, Austria and the other neutral countries in the EU. You and others want an EU army because it's another step towards the United States of Europe. You're making the same mistake that was made with the euro. The single currency was an economic mistake. It was an aim to force through a political union. It's quite clearly a failure. The euro crisis has caused much suffering, particularly in Greece, but not only in Greece. Now you want to introduce a European army in order to force through political union. Think of the crises that's going to generate. The crises with Russia, for example. You're trying to create structures which aren't based on European consensus. An army of this nature is no more practicable than the euro has shown itself to be. The euro is just about money. The army will be about human lives. So please stop. Please stop trying to centralize resources. Europe can use NATO and decentralized structures to defend itself. A centralized army is only needed if you want to attack anyone, and that's not what we want to do. We don't want the EU to be a military force which intervenes in other countries. That's quite the opposite to what we want. We want a peaceful Europe which defends itself, but which does not intervene in other countries. Thank you.
Frau Kollegin von Storch, spricht.
Thank you, Mrs. von Storch. Now for the Commission, Commissioner Andriukaitis.
Herr President, honourable members, President Juncker's priority in the area of security and defence is to strengthen European defence cooperation. A recent proposal by the Commission, as well as steps agreed upon by the Council in May and the European Council in June, are demonstrating that the EU as a whole is determined to bring defence cooperation to a higher level, invest more, collaborate more, and put more emphasis on the actual output of the effort. The reflection paper on the future of European defence, adopted on 7th of June by the Commission, offers different scenarios toward the future as a contribution to the ongoing debate, identifying the main options for the direction of travel. Such future perspectives should not let us get distracted from the concrete work which we have been undertaking over the last year. The global strategy and the new level of ambition derived from it provide us with a strategic vision and purpose which are now translating into concrete actions. Deeper defence cooperation, both in operational and capability terms, is the only way Europeans can deliver the strong and state-of-the-art military capacities that we need to address external conflicts and crises, and thus protect the European Union and its citizens. Also, in the long run, let there be no mistake. Military capabilities are and will remain owned and operated by the member states that can choose to make them available to different frameworks, as you also mentioned, including the EU, NATO, or United Nations. We are mobilizing European Union instruments to support member states, not to set up common assets for an, as you call, EU army. It's not about. Absolutely. Moreover, we recognize that NATO remains the cornerstone of Euro-Atlantic security, which provides for the collective and territorial defense of its members. Indeed, the EU is committed to strengthen its cooperation with NATO on the basis of the joint declaration of Presidents Tusk and Juncker and the Secretary General of NATO of 8 of July 2016 and its implementation. But the EU has been contributing to addressing external challenges through the common security and defence policy, crisis management missions and operations for many years. It's also nothing new. And our public and our security are demanding that we do more as Europeans to help stabilise volatile regions and build local capacities. This external action has a direct impact on our internal security. Nevertheless, such missions and operations can only take place outside the Union. Outside the Union. Like we just continue to do it. And irrespective of the particular circumstances of a conflict or crisis, the Union's action is always guided by respect for the principles of the United Nations Charter and the international law, which are essential elements of our Union. President, honourable members, the EU response to external conflicts, crises and instability will always combine different instruments, ranging from diplomacy, development and other forms of assistance to civilian or military crisis management. The complex challenges we face today cannot be tackled by one instrument alone, be it military or others. The EU has a unique mix of tools and instruments. The nature of the threats we face requires us to use a wide toolbox at EU disposal with greater flexibility, tearing down walls between external and internal, civilian and military, state and not state instruments. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Andriukaitis. For 1 minute now, Mr. Polčák.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Chairman, what von Storch said made me change my previously prepared speech. I'm convinced that her criticism that there are only few colleagues present here is inadequate because she wasn't here in June on the Thursday afternoon. So please, Madam, with all due respect. Secondly, she says Mr. Juncker allegedly said something that he didn't in fact say in his statement. And again, this is a bit over the line, I'd say. Thirdly, as far as any criticism of the Commissioner here is concerned, in the previous interpellation, which I do think is major, spoke for 16.5 minutes, and he was very much to the point. And criticizing him for that also inadequate, madam. And fourthly, and that's my last point here, a common security and defense policy, according to the Treaty of Lisbon, talks about introducing common defense measures, which are to be introduced based on common unanimous decision by Council. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Polčák.
Thank you, Mr. Polčák. Mr. JAKOVČIČ, for 1 minute, please.
Vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender. Ne mogu se oteti dojmu, poštovana kolegice Storch, da se radi o jednom krajnje politikanskom.
Ms. Storch, Mr. President, this is just populism. I think that you're a bit confused. You're putting Russia, the USA, into the same basket, and the tasks that a European army might be called upon to carry out in Hungary. But look at Syria. That's a good example. There, both the USA and the Russians are involved, and the European Union is actually paying the price in the form of migrants coming from that region. They're the people that Ms. von Storch's party want to use to destroy the European Union.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege.
Thank you, Mr. JAKOVČIČ. Now, Mr. POSPÍŠIL.
Thank you very much, President. I actually see this problem similarly to my colleagues. Mrs. von Storch is talking about a very significant topic, talking about how intensive our cooperation is going to be in the defense area among our EU countries, whether we are going to talk only about this cooperation in research, development, or whether we are actually going to reach a common army. However, the form of this question is very misleading. And so basically, it says something that Mr. Juncker has not uttered at all. To protect the European values, obviously, Mrs. von Storch, what we are talking about should be human rights. That's what we should talk about. We have been presenting it many times in the past. The European Union is one of the very few players that is standing very clearly for human rights in the world, and that is very positive. You have been talking about the United States, but you know, the United States have saved this continent twice in the past world wars. That's why I don't think that your words are appropriate. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Pospíšil.
Thank you, Mr. Pospíšil. Catch the eye now. Mr. Dzhambazki, please.
Thank you, President, colleagues, Commissioner. The subject European Army is a very controversial question. The member states do not allocate 2% of their GDP for military purposes. Cooperation for the purposes of defense is something else, and we should talk about it. If we are talking about buying arms, providing common training, this is something very productive. This is something very useful. The Commission should be thinking about that. We can even provide for a certain specialization in the military field, and this could be beneficial to the whole economy of the European Union and the member states as well. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Dzhambazki.
Thank you, Mr. Dzhambazki. Now, Mrs. MORVAI, please.
Kedves képviselőtársaim!
Colleagues, the Warsaw Pact in the days of military service was something that we used to make a lot of jokes about back in the day, and one of those jokes was that a commander said to me, said, "Run for it, the Italians are coming," and so off they ran, and then they looked behind them. There aren't any Italians, what are we running for? Well, it transpired that it was something altogether different. So What about the training of an EU army? I mean, what kind of jokes would we make then? Who would they run for? Mrs. von Storch asked about this. Who would this EU army need to fight against? An army that would have to be funded very extensively, and furthermore, what would they be able to do that NATO doesn't already do? So please take this question seriously.
Thank you, Mrs. Morvai. To wrap up the debate, I give the floor to Commissioner Andriukaitis.
Thank you very much, dear Chairman. Once again, I would like to repeat a little bit because some information is misleading. You know very well, we all know very well, that our military capacities are in the hands of member states. They own those capacities, they operate with those capacities. The decision to deploy national army forces remain at national, constitutional level, not at EU level. We are only supporting member states to deepen defense cooperation among them and foster a common European perspective, that only. Of course, the EU can only decide to deploy a military operation with a mandate to potentially use armed force outside the Union and with the mandate of United Nations Charter and international law. May I repeat once again, it's very important, Article number 2 of Treaty of European Union, which pointed, the Union is founded on the values of respect of human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect of human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. And it's our cornerstones. The EU is taking concrete steps to strengthen European security and defence that responds to clear demand by our citizens and also contribute to better sharing the burden across the Atlantic. Important, of course, to pay close attention to our strategic communications to explain to a wider audience what we are doing and trying to achieve, but also what we are not doing. And it is very important also to say what we are not doing. We are not doing EU armies. The European Parliament is absolutely critical to deliver on our promise to provide more protection and security for our citizens. We do this the European way, as I like to emphasize, using the European Union's unique mix of instruments and in partnership wherever possible. Mr. President, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Andriukaitis. That brings the debate to a close. The minutes of this meeting will be available at the next session in Parliament. If there are no objections, then that information will be sent to the relevant people. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the last sitting.